Hello, everyone, to my next Fintelekt session. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And again, I'm very thankful for Shirish and his team at Fintelekt to give us this opportunity to talk about a few issues that I believe matter. And I know we're having a mixed audience here, private sector and public sector. So today I've chosen a topic that I think is equally relevant for all of us, although it seems to address only financial intelligence units. But this is probably a bit a misconception that this is a topic that would only concern FIUs. And it's, I'm going to be speaking about the autonomy of and operational independence of FIUs, and why this matters and why it does not only matter for FIUs. So this time I have prepared a few slides, not because I want to rely too much on text on slides, but I think I'm starting with a few headlines where in the last years, FIU have made it to the news in a rather negative context. I mean, FIUs make it regularly to the news because they have been successfully working on cases or because they have disseminated useful analytical products. But in this regard, it was really negative. There's nothing to say about the countries that I mentioned, but that's all in the public domain. So it's just an FIU of a few countries have come to attention in public too. This doesn't mean that other FIUs will not have similar challenges, and I'll speak about that in a minute, a bit in more detail. So I think it started, for the first time at least I can remember, that this issue came up in the context of the membership in the Egmont Group. So as probably most of you know, the Egmont Group is the Association of Financial Intelligence Units. It's an international organization incorporated in Canada. And it's an organization that really looks after FIUs, supports them, but also has a compliance mechanism. So if FIUs do violate international standards and part of the fundament of the Egmont Group, it can be suspended or even excluded from the Egmont Group. So, and very often when this happened, it had to do, at least also to do, with a lack of autonomy and independence. So that's certainly a first statement we can make without revealing any secrets, but this is an issue that Egmont is taking very serious. So the first example that came to my mind was Nigeria a few years ago. Nigeria FIU has been readmitted to the Egmont Group after the suspension. Then we had negative news in Europe. The first one is, you probably can't read that, that's from Montenegro. Then another one in Central America, and they were all reporting about the challenges these FIUs had in maintaining their membership status at the Egmont Group. And very often in these newspapers, there were actually reference was made to the issue of independence, or in these cases, lack of independence of the FIU. And I think the most recent case that has really been in the news, not because of the size of the FIU affected, but probably of the let me say, the interest surroundings around the jurisdiction, was the FIU of the Vatican, the Holy See, that was also suspended from the Egmont Group, and reference was actually made to security threats, also arising from a potential lack of independence. So this is what I'm saying here. This is a real issue, and this is a recurring real issue, and it can have massive impact, not only on the jurisdictions concerned, but also on the reporting entities. And just very recently, and that's probably why I've chosen to talk about that subject right now, it was only less than a few weeks ago that the Egmont Group chair, Mrs. Henny Verbeek-Kösters, has issued a public statement about the concern the Egmont Group is having about misusing FIU powers. So again, this is a serious thing. This is a real thing. This is not a theoretical potential issue. This is coming up. If you read the statement of the Egmont Group chair on the website of the Egmont Group, you will actually see and I've quoted this here, it's not only about the misuse of FIU powers against, for example, government opponents, it's also about the lack of autonomy and operational independence. So there's a link between potential misuse of powers and the lack of autonomy. And I think this explains perfectly why this is a significant and sensitive matter for the whole anti-money laundering chain. The FIUs have been given with unique powers. If you look at the powers of FIUs all across the board, the differences between countries, but more or less, the FIUs have or should have a very broad access to financial information on the one hand, but also access to law enforcement information and administrative information. And there's probably no other government structure, at least in democratic country, that have so far-reaching powers. Now, power comes with responsibility, and responsibility comes with accountability. But certainly, if you have a unit, an authority in the country that has so far-reaching powers, then you must also ensure that it can act only for the purpose for which these powers have been given to the FIU. And that's solely predicate offenses to money laundering itself, of course, and terrorist finance. That's the area where the FIU works. And if an FIU is not autonomous, there may be situations where other branches of government or even organized crime would say, look, this is getting interesting for us. This is a unique body that has such a broad access to information that nobody else has. Let's try to influence their behavior. Let's try to partially or fully take control over the FIU. So we cannot give, I think in a nutshell, as a first conclusion, we cannot give so far-reaching powers to an agency when we are not able to ensure its autonomy and operational independence. As I mentioned, this has always been an important topic also for the Egmont Group and the Egmont Center for FIU Excellence and Leadership, which is part of the Egmont Group, has 2-3 years ago published a very good booklet on the concept of operational independence and autonomy of FIU. So there are a lot of misunderstandings around that concept. And this paper makes it very clear what it is and what it isn't, and what FIUs have to do to maintain their autonomous status, but also what policymakers have to do. And I think we can also talk today about what the financial sector can do about this and what interest the private sector has. Now, of course, FIU autonomy is not the goal in itself. And there were also situations where FIUs were not working effectively, and there were concerns about the effective operations of FIUs, or there were concerns about a culture of secrecy in the FIUs not collaborating effectively with, for example, law enforcement. And sometimes some FIUs were defending themselves to say, well, you can't criticize us because we are autonomous. That is not the understanding of autonomy. Autonomy always goes hand in hand with accountability too. So yes, at the end, it's the FIU that has to take its decision freely, but it doesn't mean that it is an untouchable agency. It doesn't mean that policymaker cannot raise expectations. It does not mean that the control mechanisms to ensure full accountability should not be in place. So operational independence is not total independence, and even if total independence exists, it doesn't mean a lack of autonomy. However, there have been a number of situations. Some of them made it to the public domain, as I mentioned. Some of them were treated internally in the Egmont Group, where the Egmont Group had to look after the FIUs and had to take measures to bring these FIUs back into a concept that would allow for a continuous membership. Some of these examples you can actually find them in the report. They are sanitized, of course. But when you look at the examples that were cited in the report, there are 2, maybe 3 categories of issues that came up. One was relating to the appointment and or dismissal of the head of FIU. So that's a crucial characteristic of the concept of independence autonomy, is To what degree is the procedures for appointment and dismissal of the head of the FIU and other senior staff, to what degree are they transparent, fair, and to what degree do they ensure that the FIU can work in full operational independence? The other was a category of cases that came up were related to those FIUs that are part of another agency. And this is, it's of course easier to guarantee for an autonomous FIU if the autonomous is a freestanding organization, as for example has an autonomous status within the executive branch, or is itself part of another organization, of another body like the central bank, who by definition have a high degree of autonomy themselves. However, when FIUs are part of a mostly law enforcement agencies where the concept of autonomy is not well understood, it's usually the chain of command principle that is prevalent in these organizations. Police doesn't work with autonomous units. It's a concept very badly understood, in particular in police, but also in other law enforcement bodies. Here we have seen a number of cases arising from these situations, and we'll speak about that a little bit more in detail. The third category where issues came up were relating to FIUs that were given a board composed of people from outside of the FIU. And here I think a distinction has to be made what kind of board there is. The problem can arise where the board has decision-making powers that should be autonomous decision of the FIU. It's another cup of tea when we talk about advisory boards, steering committees that do not get involved in operational business. They can also be positive for the FIU because they may be given them better access to resources. So here a distinction has to be made, and it depends very much what the powers of the board are. We can say the more it is an advisory board, the more it does not have powers to take decisions in operational matters, the less it is a concern. So, but let me not continue to speak about the problems that we have seen. They're quite well known. Let me more speak a bit about the why it is important to be autonomous, and then about the characteristics, the positive characteristics of a independent FIU. So why is it important? This concept of operational independence is a backbone of the anti-money laundering regime of all countries. And again, you know, we have got a suspicious activity reporting requirement that goes very far. And it very much touches upon privacy issues. You know, when you report about a client, report about a person, and you connect a person with a suspicion for a crime, and in some countries where the reporting threshold is relatively low, this can be very little can actually trigger. None of us can exclude that we ourselves have been mentioned in the context of an STR. So if the FIU cannot work independently and sort out what is relevant for money laundering and what isn't, then we have got issues around privacy and human rights. You know, if this information flows directly, for example, to law enforcement, then law enforcement would do what it is called to do. You know, they would start investigations, and that would infringe massively on the interests, legitimate interests of citizens. So this concept of autonomy is not just something that FIUs have invented to feel better or to feel bigger in a government context. It is also an element to protect human rights of all people that may be concerned by an FIU and that their names may have been reported in that context. The FIU is best positioned to actually filter what is worth pursuing, also worth pursuing through the instrument of a criminal investigation, and where the suspicion has not been maintained, and then ensure that the interest of these legitimate citizens can be protected. This concept of operational independence is not something new. It's not something that is specific to FIUs. You do see similar aspects and architectures for this concept in other areas, in particular in financial regulation. A lot of supervisors enjoy this operational independence for a good reason. Also, often anti-corruption bodies need to have that concept of independence because they work sometimes against the perceived interest of members of government or members of the executive branch. We also see it sometimes or often in the judiciary. So this concept is not something that is unique to FIUs. And I think we can benefit from the experiences of others also in situations where independent agencies had to fight for maintaining their independence. I think it's also an extremely important concept for the private sector, as I mentioned, not only for the protection of the clients of the financial institutions, but also the legitimate interests of the financial institutions themselves. It is not usual that private persons, including financial institutions, have an obligation to report a crime to a government body. That's quite unusual. Not only exists as a global mandatory standard in the area of money laundering and terrorist financing. Normally, we can decide not to report a crime even if we have witnessed it. There's no general global concept of obligation to report suspicion of a crime, at a relatively low level. And this comes with consequences if you do not report a crime. The financial institutions know that. So again, reporting to an FIU can protect the financial institution to be criticized against violating reporting requirements by somebody who maybe doesn't understand the full concept. The FIU is best positioned to also come up with a view whether or not the reporting requirement has been met or not because of its broad experience. But it can only do so if it is operationally independent. So I think let me speak a bit about what that means in practice and what are the characteristics of a independent or autonomous FIU. I think it all starts with governance and organizational structure. So the core of the autonomy is the free decision to analyze, receive, analyze, and then disseminate STRs. So, that's the fundament of that concept. So whether or not an STR is analyzed, whether or not information is disseminated to law enforcement or third party, whether or not an FIU shares information with another FIU abroad, this has to be the sole decision of the FIU. That has not been very often a matter of criticism. So that aspect in the very core seems to be quite well understood, and at least I wouldn't say there have been no cases. I'm sure there were, but they didn't really come to the surface so very often. So I hope also because this concept exists for, actually since the adoption of the FATF standard, and it's enshrined in the FATF standard. So for nearly 10 years, this concept is a global standard and also subject to the mutual evaluations by the FATF and the regional bodies. But it goes beyond just the pure decision whether to analyze, disseminate, or request additional information. It also means that the FIU must be freely deciding what to prioritize. Of course, the FIU will be influenced by findings of the National Risk Assessment, for example, and it will take them as a basis for the decision what to prioritize or not. And probably they would need to have good arguments if they deprioritize an area that has been massively prioritized in the NRA. But at the end of the day, it has to be the FIU's decision. Also, the decision to decide what request to answer and in what manner is something that the FIU has to decide on their own. Also, which data it utilizes in its own analytical products is something that the FIU has to decide. As I said, this is probably in most countries working okay. But again, if especially financial institutions or other bodies are aware that this is not the case, they probably should think how to bring it to the table. They should probably also think how to bring it to the attention of the assessors in the case of a mutual violation, because then remedy can be made and the problem can be resolved. As I mentioned, most cases have come up in the context of FIUs that are located within the existing structure of another authority, and most of them, those FIUs that are in police. And here the key requirement is that the functions must be separated. And this may be the case on paper, but in practice, there are significant challenges, especially in police forces that believe that everything under the wings of the police must have a police function. So this concept of an analytical FIU, certainly in continental Europe, is very badly understood in police. There are reports, including, for example, by Europol, that really have a misconception of the characteristic of an analytical unit such as the FIU. Also, elements of this more governance-related aspect of autonomy is that the FIU must have functional protection, so protection from liability. It must also be clear that the head of FIU, the senior management, should have autonomy to define the job profile of management colleagues and of staff. Yes, there can be a rule by the overarching agency how to do a job profile and what's in and what isn't in, but the content should be freely decided by the FIU on its own staff. A second category, apart from governments and administration, is budget and resources. So, of course, it would be easy on paper to guarantee the autonomy of the FIU, and you can squeeze it by not giving it adequate resources. So having access to adequate financial, human, and technical resources is a key component of the autonomy of an FIU. And this is a matter all across the board, and you'll see a lot of criticism also in mutual evaluation reports that the FIUs are under-resourced. And actually, there was very recently an article in moneylaundering.com. You probably know that publication from ACAMS. And I think the article is publicly available by Gabriel Vedren. And he comes to the conclusion that FIUs are often understaffed. And he gave some detail here. I'll not go through these statistics, but it's quite obvious that there's an imbalance of resources of FIUs. But to the benefit of time, I'll not go into detail here. But let me move on beyond budget and resources. The next important issue here is the appointment and dismissal of senior management and the head of the FIU. So clearly, the requirement is that the appointment of the head of FIU should be apolitical, timely, and based on merit. And also the decision, the particular decision to dismiss or not to renew a term-bound contract of the head of FIU should be based by objective criteria only. And I can tell you from experience, this is not always the case, and this is probably causing a lot of trouble in many countries. So my former colleagues as head of FIUs, many of them are having a difficult time, especially if they are critical of their own government, especially if they're working in corruption cases, that their position is threatened. They are replaced by somebody who is more lenient, and that is a direct attack on the autonomy of the FIU. And certainly, probably also of greatest interest to the financial institutions is the protection of information. An autonomous FIU is able and must ensure that it can protect its information at all times, also against interest from its governing body. And that is sometimes badly understood also in agencies where the FIU is located in a larger entity. as I mentioned in the beginning, operational autonomy or operational independence and autonomy doesn't mean lack of accountability. So the FIU must remain to be fully accountable for its activities. It also has to ensure the integrity of its staff and management. It has to be transparent. It has to demonstrate leadership, also including to promote the independence and autonomy. And of course, it has to ensure that the concept of autonomy is not only on paper, but also applied in practice. So this is a medal that has two coins. On the one hand, it's good for the FIU if it can enjoy this independence and autonomy. But on the other hand, I think FIUs have to do maybe even more than others on transparency and accountability. And better invest now in situations where maybe the autonomy is not threatened. I can tell you from what I've seen and from experience, the attack on the operational independence comes out of the blue sometimes, can come as a surprise, can be the result of an election result that brings in a new government. So you better, as a head of FIU, you better be prepared for a potential attack on your operational independence and autonomy. And if you can position yourself as a fully accountable, transparent, merit-based, integer organization, then you're probably best protected. And we certainly hope that the Egmont Group would continue to look after this issue and deliver on what it has promised, that it will do everything to protect FIUs that are threatened to lose their autonomy. So I think with that, I can only thank you very much again for your kind attention. I remain at your disposition through social media or directly or via Fintelekt for any questions you may have. And I'm already looking forward to seeing you again then for the next podcast. Thank you very much and have a good day.